Hello everybody, we're Andy Cornish and this is my colleague Mark Burrell.
Hello.
We're here because we have engaged in a series of conversations with prominent Australians on a topic that we're all going to be invited to answer a question about at the latter part of this year, and that is the referendum in connection with the voice. We're going to be asked a question, and that question is a proposed law to alter the Constitution to recognise the First Peoples of Australia by establishing an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice. Do you agree this proposed alteration? We thoroughly enjoyed the conversations we had with fabulous Australians, and Mark, I think together we found very powerful voices.
Yes, they're deeply impassioned, they're wise, they've committed themselves to the issues that go to the heart of this question. We hope you enjoy. We hope that these conversations stimulate your own thinking and your own conversations with friends and colleagues.
Thank you very much indeed. Welcome to the Larapinta Connect podcast, hosted by Andy Cornish, myself, and Mark Burrell, my colleague. Part of our Larapinta Connect mission is committed to understanding how we can improve the lives of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and build bridges of friendship with the business community. The topic of the moment is the voice to Parliament. A voice to Parliament is expressed by Reconciliation Australia as giving Indigenous communities a route to help inform policy and legal decisions that impact their lives. Giving people a say will lead to more effective lives, they say. Embedding it in Constitution would recognise the special place Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have in Australia's history, but it will also mean that it can't be shut down by successive governments. This is a big deal. We're being asked to change the Constitution through a referendum. And whilst there have been more than 40 referendums since our Constitution was established in 1901, only 8 of those have been successful. The current Labour government has committed to conducting a referendum on a voice to Parliament sometime in late 2023. And while the broad topic is widely known, the issues and underlying goals of Indigenous Australians broadly not. Our goal is to explore the issues and deepen understanding, to cut through the partisan messages or newspaper bromides, and having a genuine dinner conversation about what this is all about. Joining us today is Nyungai Warren Mundine, and welcome, Warren. Warren has been a strong advocate for empowering First Nations of Australia to build businesses and sustainable communities for many years. Warren has over 4 decades of experience working in public, private and community sectors. He's advised successive governments since 2004, including as chairman of the Prime Minister's Indigenous Advisory Council from 2013 to 2017. More recently, he's been vocal in arguing against the voice and that people should vote no in the upcoming referendum. He's a member of the Voice No Case Committee in the Recognise a Better Way campaign. Welcome, Warren.
Thank you for having me here.
It's great to have you here. And before we get into the heart of the conversation, what I'd love to do, if I may, is just to provide an acknowledgement to country. We're here together on the lands of the Gadigal people as part of the Eora Nation, and I'd like to welcome elders past, present and emerging. Warren, this is a very important issue for Australia, this referendum which is coming up in the latter part of the year. And I wonder if you could just give us a few minutes about your background and history and just tell us about how you are at the heart of this amazing time in our lives.
Well, it is an amazing time. It's probably the biggest thing that we're going to be looking about changing a constitution since the Constitution became alive in 1901. My background and life experiences are the ones that sort of pushed me to the no side. So I spanned from the old protection era, so when we had segregation and laws which controlled Aboriginals' life from really birth to death. And then later on, when I was about 13, 14, then after the 67 referendum and the laws, Aboriginal discriminatory laws were abolished around 69, 70, into the 70s. So I expand that entire era. And what the 67 referendum was about equality, about getting full the rights and opportunities of our citizenship. We had citizenship from 1948 onwards, but we were second-class citizens because we were still under these discriminatory laws. 67 referendum removed all that, and then we started getting positive discrimination, as they say. We're helping Aboriginal kids getting to school, with the AB study program and universities and that. And so there was this massive change, and then in the last 20 years, 14 years, we've had the growth of the indigenous business sector, which has gone from something like $6.7 million to about $8.7 billion as of today, which is an amazing thing. Created 22,000 jobs and had this amazing, important economic rise for us, which really is the way to go, which is education and economic prosperity. No race in the world's ever got out of poverty without actually having an economic and an educated working skill class and an economic prosperity. So I've always believed and you look at it going back to 1973, we've always had a voice under different names, of course. The National Aboriginal Consultative Council and the National Aboriginal Council and the National Aboriginal Conference, and then the ADSIC and the National Indigenous Council, and then the Prime Minister's Indigenous Advisory Council, and then the Coalition of the Peaks, and now we got that. And that they were all advisory, senior advisory groups to the Parliament of the day and the Prime Ministers of the day. And now, so I always, so when they say they're going to have another, a advisory council, the voice within the Constitution, I'm sitting there, but what is the evidence that that's going to make any difference when we got 50 years of evidence? And I'm not totally critical of it because there were some huge advances. But, when you look at the statistics of life and span, education and so on, there's not been that great a difference at all. In fact, the last Closing the Gap reports had a number of issues going backwards.
Right. So turning to the voice, and you mentioned there that you sort of had this natural leaning towards no, and in the summary that you just gave of all of the different advisory groups, could you distill for us what it is for you that means that you're more inclined to go down that no route, so that the people that are watching and listening to this podcast have got a bit more clarity about the way they should be thinking.
Yeah, and also I'm backed up with, I just did a critique of the Tom Calma, Marcia Langton review and their recommendations from that, and it's something like 260 pages, and that's how, I just give up sleeping at night reading that. And that's going to come out soon. I've got a series of articles about it. I see it as it becoming a huge bureaucracy. You got several levels of you got the regions, you also got locals, then you got the federal level, and so each of those bodies are going to need experts and advisors and support staff, and that. So all of a sudden you start seeing this big organisation that's being built, and we've had several of them in the past, and all they did was really benefited the people who were at that table and the staff. Didn't do very much for Aboriginal people at all. And so I see it as a huge bureaucracy. I see it taking funds that we could be better spent at that lower levels in regard to dealing with the family issues, the education and the economic prosperity.
Yeah, I mean, so the sort of thing when I sit and look at it is that I get a bit confused about is we've seen and know that the incarceration rates of young Aboriginal people is an absolutely dreadful statistic. And the situation in Alice Springs has been poor in the last several months. Isn't there something, though, that with the voice, given that this is now going to be embedded within the Constitution, that whilst it does provide that advice, as you mentioned before, does it give us a better chance potentially of getting cut through on behalf of First Nations peoples?
Well, the issue I have is, and this is their words, it's not mine, advice. I believe it goes a bit further than that. We've had this before. We had heaps of it before, and the people who are working on this advisory Yes campaign, a lot of them actually been in charge of those areas. So I don't believe that overnight they're just going to change and start focusing on the real issues. When you look at the issues in Alice Springs and Laverton and many other places around the country, the issues are very local, and the alcohol and crime is a result of how people are living in those communities. Now, that in Alice Springs, most of those people were from the outstations. They come in. Then we've got to start focusing on what's in the outstations, what is causing that problem. And they're going to be some hard questions, really hard questions. I've been working in this area for 20-something years, 30 years, with governments. Prior to that, I was, working with Aboriginal organisations and businesses and that. I see that as a focus on the ground, that's not a top-down approach, and that's how I see it, top-down, that you've got to really work with re-establishing those social issues, and then social safety and social, getting education and infrastructure and programs into those areas. And the only way, and to do that, you're going to have employment. And the only way you get employment is when you have businesses that are commercial and profitable, and they hire people and they help people get educated and go from there. I can't see a bureaucratic people sitting around a table making those decisions, because you've got to really make hard decisions. When I left Prime Minister Turnbull in 2017, after he asked me to do another term of 4 years, and I thought, no, I think I want to get back to the private sector. The issue for me was, he asked me, he said, can you give me a paper, what you think that should be done? And I wrote a 6-page paper.
Right.
And it was a very simple, very straightforward, very practical thing. Now, the good news was they did take up a number of those dot points that I put in there. But it's the management of it, how they managed it. Then we were looking at how we can get investment business people and involved in those communities and creating those small businesses that are needed.
Yeah.
What they did was they hired bureaucrats, and they were the ones who were supposed to get out there and do that, and that didn't make a difference at all. And this is the problem. There's been a great lot of policies and directions and that were coming out to help development happen, but it's the way they structure it. And what they do is they usually end up with a huge bureaucracy, and there's a lot of paperwork going around.
But can I come in on that point, Warren? Because I think that that's a really important point you're raising. I mean, if I'm hearing you correctly, the heart of your objection is that you're not convinced that the voice will enable these local, on-the-ground solutions, and it'll create a bureaucracy. What I hear other Indigenous advocates saying is that the voice will do a couple of very important things.
Yeah.
In my language, one's moral and the other one's practical. So sort of at a moral level, it'll restore and take steps towards the restoration of some of the originating harms that Indigenous communities still feel about not being recognised, about racial discrimination, by giving a more direct voice into Parliament. And then that process in turn will provide more influence over the sorts of policies that get in the way of those local solutions. So could you give us your view on that?
Well, I find that an interesting one, especially when you talk about the morals and you talk about dealing with racism. We've probably got some of the most strongest laws in the world in regard to racism, and you've seen people charged over these issues and that. So the issue isn't about more laws or making the laws tougher and stronger. The issue is about how do we stop things in the first place. Now, I sat on the Juvenile Crime Prevention Committee in New South Wales here for 4 years in the early noughties, and then I also did the child sexual abuse here in New South Wales. I was the co-chair of that, and I did the prisons. We looked at prisons and juvenile detention centres. I'm of the mind that we need to really crack this down. You've got to go from women's health, and then so you're not having babies, and then they're having a health. They're born healthy. They're looking after it, and then we get the first 7 years of life. We work with that, and we don't lock kids up. We looked at Britain, Canada, the United States, New Zealand, and jurisdictions around Australia. We found no evidence that locking kids up actually works. Now, of course, there are certain crimes that you've got to take those kids out of the community because of the danger they are to that community. But most of the crimes, like stealing a car or breaking and entering or doing other things, if you put them through a diversionary program, the evidence is that 80% of them you never see again.
But I think this is a good example of kind of what I'm trying to think into, actually. And so part of my motivation here is to, get clarity as well, which is that, it seems, if I'm hearing you correctly and others, is that the way government and at a policy level, parliamentary level and at an executive level have operated has often failed to adequately understand what needs to happen on the ground in a way that can really address these issues. And so isn't the voice trying to circumnavigate that? It's trying to sort of cut through and give Indigenous representatives more power and influence over those sorts of very significant decisions.
That's the rhetoric.
You don't believe that?
No, I don't believe, because I've seen these people operating before, and I know the mechanisms of government pretty well, especially in a federation, because one of the biggest problems I had at operating at that level in the federal sphere was that 90-something% of things that you need to fix things on the ground are held by states and territories. They're sovereign. And so we've got 6 sovereign states plus the federal state sovereign, and they can't tell each other what to do. They have to work together and do things. And that then creates a huge bureaucracy in that as well. And all you're doing is creating bureaucracies after bureaucracies, having committee meetings, having chats, when you should be getting out on the ground. Like one of the recommendations I said in the economic prosperity area was that you actually have people who got money and training, and they can go out and look for entrepreneurs, give them the money, set up small businesses and operate from there, and help them with their bookkeeping and their taxes and so on and that. And you have a better outcome within 7 to 10 years than you would ever have doing other things, spending lots of money. The issue isn't about money. The issue isn't about having committees set up and talking about things. We already know what works. When I was sitting in my office in Parliament House there, we had boxes of reports that have been done over the last 50 years. We know what it is. And when I look at the Langton review, to me, it's just another layer of bureaucracy when you see how they're looking at setting it up. And that costs a lot of money, we first spent $35 million already.
So, a hypothetical question, and if you could be convinced and that it's not going to be a bureaucracy that just is another layer of process, that somehow it can operate in a way that's effective and cut through and brings, economic opportunities forward, would that be enough to make you say, yes, this is worth doing? Or is there
there's two different things about recognition in the Constitution and actually doing
Yeah.
programs that are happening out there. my answer to your question is, if this thing is so good and they know it can work today, and the Prime Minister and the Minister for Indigenous Australians said that at Alice Springs when I went up there, if we would have had a voice in place, this would not have happened. Well, my challenge was, well, prove it. So I'm up for them setting it up today. They got the legislative power to do it. The Parliament's got the power to do it, and let it run. And let's see what works and what doesn't work. Even the most best idea in the world will still have little quirks and little problems in. You can look at it and fix it and do things and that. But what we seem to be doing here is putting the cart before the horse, in that we're saying, okay, we'll do the referendum and then we'll do it, fix it afterwards.
Yeah, it does say that. I suppose that the way that I get then and need a bit more clarity is that I recognise that First Nations folk have been looking to change the way they've lived for many, many generations. But this came together for me in 2017 with the Uluru Statement of the Heart. And the Uluru Statement of the Heart, when I read it, I thought this was a wonderful, beautiful document, but it was the first time that I'd read something where all of the Indigenous peoples had come together to support something that I'd seen.
Well, I challenge that.
Yeah, but it was in my recent history, perhaps, then that's
no, but in regard to saying, no, the statement's a nice statement.
Sure.
It's, it's like a lot of things, like the Declaration of Independence of the United States is a beautiful statement. It's about, all men were created equal under God. But the bloke who wrote it was a slave owner. So what they were looking at is not what it was today. They were looking to how do we work to that and get there. And of course, it cost 400,000 soldiers' lives during the Civil War, and they're still having problems getting to the position that they want to get to, where all people are created equal, and the society looks at that way. I see with the when I look at the voice, first of all, you had to get an invitation to go. They say
to the Uluru Statement.
No, they had about 9,000 people. They got, before that, you had to be invited to go to it. They argued the reason they did that was because they wanted to get consensus. So that doesn't make me feel comfortable too. Because as a businessman, I always like to have a crazy person in the room. So when I come up with a brilliant idea, or some of my staff do, and we're going to do that, there's someone there to challenge it and make you think about things. Now, you may end up coming to the conclusion to keep on doing what you're doing, but at least you had to think about it and be challenged about it. Having invitations for people to go to pick delegates to go to Uluru, I don't think it was a mistake in the first place.
So you don't think it's really representative?
No, because I go around the country, and the biggest group of Aboriginal people are in. They don't really know about it. They don't, and some of them didn't even hear of it. And when you look at Stan Grant, you can go on the ABC website of his story about his family, 200 people come together at Warren Gester. They, the majority of those people there actually didn't know anything about the voice, and that's his own family, and Stan's out there every day on the TV or radio talking about it. So to me, that's the biggest cohort. So if people don't know about it or they don't understand it already, then the idea that this is a representation of Aboriginal people, then that's not true, because there's a lot of people out there who are no voters and yes voters, but the vast majority of them, they don't know.
Well, this is why I think your voice, sorry, Mark, this is why I think your voice is so important, because what you're doing is you're providing some challenge to what is being put out there as something that is seen as an emotional sort of connection. It's an obvious thing to do. And so why would you vote against it? And so I think your challenges are really interesting. If we go back to the Uluru Statement, where it calls for then the Constitution to recognise through the voice, and then truth-telling and treaty will come after that. Is that something that then, given those comments you've just made, does that not resonate with you as something that's either representative or reasonable?
Look, there's a lot of reasonable stuff in it. There's a lot of heart strings pulling at your heart in the document. My criticism isn't of the document itself. My criticism is the practicality of its workings. You know, It's like I was saying about the Declaration of Independence, and that was just wonderful words, and it was very revolutionary for the 18th century, 1776, when most of the world was run by kings and dictators, and they had this, but it's about how you then put that into place, and it's a huge, difficult journey that they went through. That was nearly 150 years before Martin Luther King came along.
But I think that's sort of what how I look at the situation too, and I notice is a lot of the focus in conversations I have with friends, which is, I hadn't heard those perspectives about the representation to the Statement of the Heart. Notwithstanding that, I look at it, I know plenty of others who look at it and see it as an extraordinary piece of almost poetry in what it speaks to as a possibility.
Yeah.
And so I know personally, and I think many people I speak to feel, I go back to this word moral, feel a sense that there is an opportunity to take a step that restores or activates the goodwill of Australians to give Indigenous people more influence and power.
Yeah.
And so that I think the Uluru Statement from the Heart speaks to that well. Then there's the practical part, which is, okay, we're also being asked to adjust the Constitution. So this is where it gets complex in my mind.
Yeah.
When I look at the eight referendums that have passed, they all seem to me to be almost obvious things you would pass, like statements of conscience, like the 1967 one, or, the plebiscite on conscription. Australians said, no, the state doesn't have the right to own people's body. This we're being asked to make a profound change to the Constitution. So this is where my head kicks in. I go, this worries me. Because, like you were saying, the law of unintended consequences, the risks. So how would you invite us all to think into, the implications and the issues that are being proposed around the actual constitutional change and the risks associated?
Well, the Constitution is the basis of how the law operates. And so everything comes out of that Constitution. Every law, the powers of the Parliament, the powers of the executive, the powers of the judiciary, the powers of the citizen, and that all comes out of the Constitution and how we operate as a federation. And a lot of people didn't understand that. I didn't quite understand how we operated as a federation until I was actually the advisor to two prime ministers. And then you see this class of sovereignty that happens. And then it wasn't until COVID that people really woke up to the thing that the states have a bloody lot of power, like that the federal government just sort of left standing there and just pay the bills, while the states and territories were the ones who made the decision what was going to happen and where it was going to go. So for me, I think words and symbols are very important. Some people don't. Some people just totally focus on the practicality. I spend most of my time focusing on the practicality, how do you get business and do things and that. But symbols and words to me, like the Declaration of Independence, that is a massive thing and people around the world say, wow, we are, like when you're in France, people see them as the sovereign, not the government or the king, the president or whatever. So they can be very powerful things that open up opportunities to make changes in that. So that's why I'm not critical of the statement and that. There's some really powerful words.
Yeah.
But what does it mean in practical terms? So, for instance, what does truth talking mean in practical terms? And whose truth is it in practical terms?
But that's a bit further down the path, though, isn't it, Warren? I mean, going back to...
No, but it opens the gate for it.
Yeah. I think it does open a gate for it. But I think that the Uluru Statement for me was very clear. It says, literally, we call for the establishment of a First Nations voice enshrined in the Constitution. And that is, I think, a very certain position that it takes as to what it looks for us to do. And I think what I'm hearing you say is that you support the intent of that, but you're very concerned that the way that it's being positioned at the moment is that it leads to something which is unintended, bureaucratic, and could be ineffective.
Yes.
So what would you suggest? You've talked and alluded to the fact that potentially direct funding is the way to go. Could you just help whoever's listening to this conversation as to what would you think is a better alternative to what is a significant change that should happen from a constitutional perspective?
A significant change, and I'm not going to pretend I'm a lawyer because I'm
Sure.
not. But the arguments I'm seeing from very esteemed lawyers and that judges, Supreme Court, former Chief Justices, and that's a concern as well. And then when you look at some of the case laws that have happened just recently, in fact, only a couple of months ago, with the Tiwi Islands gas project. Now, what the High Court determined was that the minister had, not think about it, had to take on board the concerns of the Aboriginal community of that area. Now, so when people tell me, and that was only a recent decision of the High Court, so when people tell me that the minister's not going to, he doesn't have to take on this stuff, well, that's not our constitutional law as it stands today. So what in this yes is going to change that, So some of these things I find necessary, because now the law's been created that you must go out and have these conversations. But they're talking about people on the ground. So when you're talking about traditional owners who own the country, you must do that. You must talk to them. You must, sort of like.
But through their representatives of the Voice Council. So, as I understand it, the proposal is not that all levels of government have to talk with all Indigenous people. They've got to speak to the Indigenous people's representatives, which is the Voice. So, to me, that seems like a powerful step towards being able to take into account more effectively the concerns and interests of First Nations people. But also, I'm equally swayed by the points of view, and I think I've heard you make them elsewhere, that actually that opens the gates not only for bureaucracy, but for also sort of constipating the works of government.
Yes.
And I know, you and your colleagues in the A Better Way campaign have spoken a bit about that. I mean, what's your sense of, what's your view about those mechanisms? And, let's say it goes ahead. What could you imagine that doing that actually creates better outcomes? What could you imagine it doing that might cause problems?
Yeah. Well, after the referendum goes through and is passed, I've made the statement that I'd work to make it work. And of course, a lot of people think, some people think, I shouldn't say a lot, some people think that means I'm looking at the mechanisms of the Cal-Marlington paper, and I'm actually not. Over the next couple of weeks, people will see it in the national newspapers, my critique of all that, as I pulled it apart and went through its entrails. Probably puts a bad image in your head, but you go
if you can share it now, like what's the essence of your concern?
The essence of the concern is you'll end up with a huge bureaucracy, and that's how they talk about it really in the papers. That you got these regions and you got
like another level of government.
Yeah, another level of government. They do talk about very strongly about Aboriginals have to have a say in just about everything, and also the selection mechanisms they put there is not actually a vote or anything like that. It's community organisations will pick their reps that will sit around the table and do things.
Right.
We've been doing that forever, and I can see a lot of people who are not members of those organisations, which is most Aboriginals, by the way. You look at the land councils in New South Wales, there's 22,000 members of the land council and there's 270,000 Aboriginals. So that's about 250,000 Aboriginals are just locked out of that decision making.
Yeah.
But what I hear is that what I hear from you saying all of that is that that's great cautionary stuff and content, which says if the constitutional change is a point of principle and law is designed by government and the executive government, then surely those words of wisdom associated with we must be very cautious about not having unintended consequences, why can that not be sorted out in the process that now goes forward before this becomes law? Why are you saying no rather than I'm sceptical about whether this could work?
Well, it's a no to the constitutional side.
Right.
And I've made it public statements that if people believe it's good, then let's trial it and see if it works.
Yeah.
I don't buy a car without jumping in the car and.
But that may go back to the Uluru Statement, Warren, where if people believe that the Uluru Statement has primacy, where there is a constitution, where the Uluru Statement says, as I read out, that there is a requirement or request for the voice to be embedded within the Constitution. To support the Uluru Statement suggests that you can't trial it. It'll take a number of years to set it up in any event, which has been explained as something that was in the Langton report, is that it's going to take a little while to get. So we could be 3 years or 4 years down the track of trialling something. At that point, we then may be in a constitutional situation where it feels to some, I would say, in the Indigenous communities that we failed to actually support the requirements that came out of the Uluru Statement.
Well, we're going to do that anyway. You look at we've done several years leading up to it now. The Prime Minister has made it quite clear that it's not like the day after the referendum goes through, we're going to start to work on it. He says it's another 2 years after that. So you're going to end up with probably 4 or 5 years, including the stuff we're starting from today.
Yes.
And look, time is always. People say we need to do things quickly and that. Well, to me, the simplest thing if you need to do things quickly is to set it up today.
Yeah, I think this is this is to me one of the biggest risks of the current process. It's kind of saying to the Australian public, look into your heart about the rightness of giving Indigenous people a stronger say. And I think most Australians would say, yeah.
We did polling, 90% of it.
But then it's saying, and trust the lawyers to make the biggest change in the Constitution.
No, trust the government. This is about executive government making decisions. They make the laws.
Well, after the Constitution
After the Constitution. So this is a point of principle. As I see it, this is a question of principle, and that's the way that I've been reading it, that the constitutional change that we're being asked to accept is that our elected government is the one that will then interpret that as to the laws that it then makes. And so that's, I think, the question that we've got to say, are we going to trust the government to be able to make the laws that will make this practical? That's the way that I think that what Warren's caution is, I completely and utterly support it, because the last thing you would want is to layer more and more bureaucracy on something. But Megan Davis is saying, and I agree with some of the things that she says, which is to say that what the current system that we have is not working. And so surely, to your point, give this a chance, because the disagreement potentially around those that are saying we should do the constitutional change now is, one, if it takes a few years and we don't have it in the Constitution, a change of government could mean that they won't allow for the referendum to take place. And
I understand that part.
Yeah. And so you have to confront this now is the sort of sense that I get of people.
I think that's a fair argument. I think what I was probably trying to say was more that the risk that the subtle message is trust those who are kind of smarter than you to get the constitutional details right. And I don't think that's a basis for people to vote yes for a significant change. So there's a kind of big risk there. And I think
the Constitution has changed, though, Mark. The Constitution is fixed. It's not the constitutional details, isn't it? It's the application.
No, there's a whole change to the Constitution that has to happen.
Yeah. But that's agreed. Those words are agreed. We know what that is.
Yes, but the implications of that is significant.
Absolutely, that's what executive government has got to determine.
But there's
So I think that's a risk because there's lots of confusion about that. I mean, just look at this conversation. We're coming at this, I think, with a lot of goodwill, and we're trying to navigate our way through it.
Absolutely, it's difficult.
So there's a risk that some people are going to say, "Oh, just look at that confusion. That's the reason why you shouldn't." But there's another issue, and it's more controversial, and I want to get your perspective on it, which is folks who are saying this introduces a race-based or sets up a group of people based on race to have more influence, democratic influence than the rest of Australians. What's your take on that?
Well, I'm a simple bloke. I'm not a philosopher or anything like that. My simple thing is, if you're talking about a race of people, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, and they will have this voice in the Constitution, then that is a race-based thing. It's just a common sense. I think I don't necessarily agree with some of the strong attacks about that. In fact, I'm a supporter of having Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders in the Constitution as recognition of their, they're the first people here and so on. And we can debate what those words and everything would be. But you can't get away from the fact that